How are you guys all doing? Just think, only a couple more days, and we finally get a break. It feels like this semester's gone on for forever. You guys hanging in? Okay. How many of you are ready for a break? Yeah, it's been pretty much a long slog, hasn't it? All right. Today is going to be a lot more discussion on your part, because we're going to be discussing things that I asked you to read about in The Omnivore's Dilemma, in particular the chapter on big organic. And then as we get to the end of going through the information of that chapter, we will then start talking about organic standards and how the government regulates a producer's ability to label their food in a variety of ways, but one of the main ways in which food labeling is important is through organic certification. So if you look in The Omnivore's Dilemma on page 132, there's this section where Michael Pollan basically calls up Joel Salatin and wants Joel Salatin to ship him some of Joel Salatin's beef as he's doing research for the book. And basically Joel Salatin refuses because Joel Salatin's farm is in Virginia, and Michael Pollan is a journalism professor at Berkeley in the San Francisco area. So Salatin basically says he's not going to ship his meat across the country. It just goes against all of his principles as a bioregional farmer. And so, but during the process of talking to him about this, it says on page 132, I asked him what was on his bookshelf, a bunch of classic texts of organic chemistry, organic agriculture rather, and American agrarianism. And then he has a quote from Salatin. And Salatin says, "We never call ourselves organic, we'll call ourselves beyond organic. Why dumb down to a lesser level than we are? If I said I was organic, people would fuss at me for getting seed corn from a neighbor who might be using atrazine. Well, I would much rather use my money to keep my neighborhood productive and healthy than export my dollars 500 miles away to get a pure product that's really coated in diesel fuel. There are a whole lot more variables in making the right decision than does the chicken feed have chemicals or not. Like what sort of habitat is going to allow that chicken to express its physiological distinctiveness? A 10,000 bird shed that stinks to high heaven, or a new paddock of fresh green grass every day? Now, which chicken shall we call organic? I'm afraid you'll have to ask the government, because now they own the word." So this was in the chapter before chapter 9, but what is Salatin getting at in this little rant that is communicated on page 132? That wasn't a rhetorical question. Wake up, people. Come on, be with me.
I think he was kind of trying to talk about the idea that they discussed in chapter 9 of that, like, organic isn't necessarily organic. Like, we think of that being this, like, I don't know, that word that means like it's perfect and healthy, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that necessarily, because the government has kind of twisted it to make it its own thing.
Okay, so it isn't that the government has twisted it. It's just that when you think of organic food, certainly it has these connotations of, oh, it's this great food, we should all be eating it, and things like this. But what it really is it's a label. It's a label that goes on food to indicate certain things that you can count on about that food. How many of you had looked at the organic standards on the USDA's website prior to me asking you to do that on Monday? I don't see any hands going up. You guys just don't hang out on the U.S. Department of Agriculture Organic Standards page in your spare time? It's scintillating reading. No, of course you don't. Who does that? Okay, I do that. But I'm different than most people you've probably met. So the organic label is precisely that. It's a label that is designed to signify certain things about the food that you eat. And Salatin's point here is that organic is just a label. And if you asked about it, he would say that it's a stupid label. And he's basically getting at that here. In the end, at the end of this chapter, the chapter 8, he says, as I indicated earlier, I got my quotes, but in the end, I didn't get my food. Before we got off the phone, I asked Salatin if he could ship me one of his chickens and maybe a steak too. He said that he couldn't do that. I figured he meant he wasn't set up for shipping, so I offered him my FedEx account number. And the quote is, no, I don't think you understand. I don't believe it's sustainable or organic, if you will, to FedEx meat all around the country. I'm sorry, but I can't do it. Just because we can ship organic lettuce from the Salinas Valley or organic cut flowers from Peru doesn't mean we should do it, not if we're really serious about energy and seasonality and bioregionalism. I'm afraid if you want to try one of our chickens, you're going to have to drive down here to Swoop to pick it up, which is eventually what I did. But before I traveled to Virginia for my week on the farm, I spent several weeks touring the organic empire to see if Salatin's criticisms, which had taken me by surprise, were just. So in the end, he has a number of objections to the organic label. One of them deals with what we just talked about, which is bioregionalism, keeping food consumption close to where the food is produced. What are his other beefs with organic? Clearly, he has opinions about chicken raising, modern chicken raising. What is Salatin's opinion about chickens and the way we raise chickens?
He would rather raise it to be more of its natural self than put it in a 10,000 bird shed with a bunch of other ones.
Yeah, so one of Salatin's views, and it's a view that came through, I think, in the Practicing Complexity chapter, is he organizes his farm around allowing his animals to do what those animals would normally do if they were out in nature, hadn't been domesticated by human beings. If humans had never intervened in their existences, what would a cow be doing? What would a chicken be doing? What would a pig be doing? And so he raises his pigs in the forest where they root around for grubs and fungi and things like this. He leaves his cows on pasture most of the year. He lets his chickens roam around on pasture eating grasses and legumes and a certain number of insects. Because, of course, where do chickens hail from originally? Where did they first evolve and can still be found in the wild, actually? taking you back to the evolutionary roots of domesticated animals that we talked about some time ago now.
I don't really remember, but wasn't it Europe, somewhere around there?
Not chickens, not chickens. Other things, well, really nothing really originated in Europe except for pigs, where there were already natural progenitors of pigs. Most of our currently domestic hoof stock came from the Fertile Crescent region, but chickens came from someplace else.
Southeast Asia.
Yeah, Southeast Asia. And if you talk to an ornithologist, the accepted common name of chickens is jungle fowl. And so it's the Southeast Asian jungle fowl. And so these things can be found in forests in Indonesia. I think when we went through this material back when we first covered it, I mentioned that in 2010, I went to a meeting that was in Bali. And while I was in Bali, I traveled around Southeast Asia a little bit. I went to Komodo, I went to Java, I went to Krakatoa. And I was surprised in these natural areas that I was visiting. I was visiting a bunch of national parks and things like this. In these natural areas, we ran across chickens that were out in the forest, and these weren't chickens that had been that had escaped from people's farms and whatnot. These were the original jungle fowl that you find still to this day in the forest of Southeast Asia. And so we don't generally see jungle fowl out in the field eating a large diet of grains. We see jungle fowl out in the field essentially foraging for vegetable matter and foraging for insects. And one of the things that Joel Salatin's method of rotational grazing does for chickens is it gives them a healthy supply of insects. Now, I've started growing my own chickens. We got some chickens back in May. We built them a chicken coop back in April. And they have just now started producing eggs. They started about 3 or 4 weeks ago, produced their first eggs. We're up to about 3 or 4 eggs a day now. And when they first started producing eggs, the first thing that I did was I cracked, the first meal that I made out of these eggs is I cracked the eggs into a bowl and also cracked some store-bought eggs into a bowl right next to them to basically look at the difference. And Salatin has talked about, or Poland rather, has talked about this difference between Salatin's eggs and store-bought eggs. But normally when you crack an egg, so normally an egg is shaped like this, and there's a yolk in the middle, and then there's the egg white, which in science term is referred to as the albumin. And that's pretty much it. There's a distinct, so the yolk is where the embryo would be growing on the surface of the yolk. This is where most of the energy is coming from. And then all of the egg white. And so these are very different in terms of their composition, a lot of fat in the yolk and a lot of protein in the egg white. And that distinction is pretty obvious. There's the yolk, which is yellow, and then the white that is clear. When you look at my eggs, for example, you see that there's white and you see that there's yolk. But when you crack these things into a pan or into a bowl, you know, they take whatever shape the pan is. And in my eggs that my chickens produce, there's the yolk, but then there is a denser area around the yolk that kind of, if you look at it from the side, if you turn this on its side, most of the yolk is like this. Then there's a little bulge up, sorry, most of the white is like this. There's a little bulge up, and then there's the yolk, and then there's a little bulge, and then there's the rest of the white. And so this thickened part that is around the yolk, this thickened part of the white, is basically just added protein. And so one of the things that you find when you grow chickens on your own compared to a store-bought egg, which would just be kind of all white until you get to the yolk and then all white, you don't see this thickening of the white. And this is why when I go to do things like make flourless chocolate cake and things like that, I try and get farm-raised eggs. Or now I'll just rely on my own eggs for doing this. But that extra protein comes from a change in the diet. If you're raising your chickens primarily on grain, then they're not going to have that added protein component, which is what the addition of insects to the diet adds. Now, my chickens are not free-range chickens because free-range chickens are not allowed in Liberty. You have to keep them in a run, but we've provided our chickens with a pretty good-sized run compared to what is required by the city. It's about double the size of the run that is required by the city. And it's, if you count then the space underneath the chicken house, it's about 3 times the amount of outdoor space that they have to run around in. And even though there's not a lot of vegetation in there anymore, they have a lot of access to insects coming in and out of the chicken run area. And as a result, we get qualitatively different eggs due to that, because we're not raising a bunch of chickens in a chicken house where they never leave the chicken house and they get fed nothing but grain. And so we augment our chickens with a lot of table scraps. So whenever we're chopping up vegetables and things like that, we take the vegetables out to the chicken coop and we put them in the yard. And with each new vegetable that we have, so we just put a bunch of pumpkins out there that they've been pecking away at. With each new addition, they spend about 10 minutes being deathly afraid of it until one of them comes over and starts pecking at it, and they realize, oh, this is actually pretty good, and then the rest will come over and join in. So after the initial wave of terror, they eventually eat it. So they're getting a much more diverse diet than what you would get at a commercial chicken operation. In the case of Joel Salatin's chickens, his chickens are out there just in the field. They're surrounded by a little portable electric fence to keep them in and to keep predators out, but they're out there just doing what chickens do. The cows are out there doing what cows do, the pigs are out there doing what pigs do. And Salatin makes a claim, I forget where it is in the book, that his livestock and his chickens are happier than chickens that you would find growing in a large commercial chicken house, because they get to kind of live out lives that are closer to what their evolutionary progenitors would have experienced. And so for this reason, he says, it doesn't really matter so much what you feed them as much as how you let them live out their lives. And he argues, and I think he argues effectively, that that improves not only the life of the animal, but it also improves the quality of the product that he produces. What else is in this little rant that he went on? He mentions it a couple of times. We talked about bioregionalism. We talked about how one raises the food. What else was in this section? just to remind you, he says, I would much rather use my money to keep my neighborhood productive and healthy than export my dollars 500 miles away to get a pure product in quotes, that's really coated in diesel fuel. What does he mean that his chicken would be coated in diesel fuel? Or that the food that he would feed his chicken would be coated in diesel fuel?
Does it have to do with like all the shipping and stuff that it would take to get to him?
Yeah, so part of that is shipping. So when he talks about being coated in diesel fuel, he's actually referring to the fuel that would be required to ship these things around, which was one of his objections to sending Michael Pollan some chicken and beef in the first place. But what else do we use fossil fuels for on farms?
Equipment?
Okay, so part of what we do is we use it to power tractors and things like that. But what else is an input into farms that comes from fossil fuels? It's an energy intensive process that is involved in making something that is used on the farm that requires a lot of energy because of the chemical bonds that are involved that have to be broken in order to make this substance. Once again, I'm asking you to go back and remember something that was on a previous test. What substance do people produce, corporations produce, that is necessary on a lot of farms to increase productivity, that is derived from the energy that is required to break the bonds between a particular pair of atoms in order to convert it from a usable form from a non-usable form rather to a usable form?
Would it be like fertilizers and pesticides?
It is exactly fertilizer. I'm thinking of nitrogen. So nitrate fertilizers, ammonium nitrate fertilizers. In order to make them, you have to do industrial nitrogen fixation. Industrial nitrogen fixation is very energy intensive because of the triple bonds that hold the two nitrogen atoms together when it's in its gaseous state in the atmosphere. And so if you're supplementing your farm with a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, like George Naylor has to do with his corn crops, which are very nitrogen intensive, then you have, in addition to the fossil fuel inputs into that farm, in terms of the farm machinery and the diesel that is required to run that farm machinery, you also then have this fossil fuel input that isn't fossil fuels directly, but it's something that we use the energy from fossil fuels to generate, and that is nitrogen fertilizers. And so conventional farming is very energy intensive activity because of all of these fossil fuel inputs. And Salatin would just rather not do that. He basically grows nothing but animals for the most part, and the feed, the pasture that those animals grow on. But as a result, he doesn't really have to have a lot of these external inputs coming into his farm. And so in that way, he thinks that his way of farming meat is preferable to other ways of farming meat. Imagine if you take a steer graze it on pasture for the first 6 months of its life and then move it to an animal feedlot, you're going to be feeding that animal in the feedlot on silage, which is just old field waste that has been ground up and used as animal feed. But you're also going to be feeding them with a bunch of grain crops. We haven't talked about pokey feeders yet, have we? No, that's going to be our next reading assignment, is to go back and read about pokey feeders, which is in the first part of the book, but it's a good contrast with this part of the book that we're currently in. So at pokey feeders, it's this feedlot out in western Kansas, just north of Garden City, and it's embedded right in the middle of a bunch of agricultural area that is primarily producing corn and soybeans and wheat. And the products of those fields get harvested, they get sent to pokey feeders, and they're used to feed the cows that are at this concentrated animal feeding operation. One of the reasons that feeding operation was placed there is simply because it's cheaper to put your feeding operation embedded in an area that is producing a lot of the crop that you're going to feed those cows, rather than put your feeding operation someplace else and then having to ship all of that stuff to wherever you're feeding those cows. It's way easier to ship the cows there once than it is to ship the grains there constantly over time. All right, so let's get into chapter 9. Give me some of your thoughts about chapter 9 as you read through it. At the beginning of the chapter, he talks about a chicken that he encounters at the Whole Foods. What's up with the chicken? Rosie, the sustainably farmed free-range chicken, which he then, of course, revisits later in the chapter.
He says that from the farm, the Petaluma poultry, they try to keep or create relationships in nature and basically just keep the chickens healthy and natural.
Yeah, farming methods strive to create harmonious relationships in nature, sustaining the health of all creatures in the natural world. And then he follows that up with his kind of assessment of that. Okay, not the most mellifluous or even meaningful sentence, but at least our heart's in the right place. When you look at that sentence, farming methods strive to create harmonious relationships in nature, sustaining the health of all creatures and the natural world. What are your thoughts about that particular advertising tagline?
I feel like for the people that are buying chicken, they care a lot about the environment. They'll definitely gravitate towards that type of chicken and that company.
But what does that mean? What does that sentence mean?
I feel like they care about a lot of how the chicken lives its life. It seems like.
What exactly is a harmonious relationship for a chicken?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. The harmonious relationship is you have a chicken in a chicken house. You feed it food. If that food is mainly grains, you're feeding it food that it wouldn't normally eat if it was out in nature and hadn't hadn't ever been domesticated by human beings. And ultimately, you're going to send it off to a slaughterhouse where you kill it so that people can eat it. I just don't see a lot that's super harmonious about that. In the latter part of the book, this is starting over on page 169, section 4 of this chapter says, "Meet Rosie, the organic free-range chicken." What does Poland relate about Rosie, the free-range chicken?
I think he kind of goes on to find that like that picture they painted at the beginning isn't necessarily what's happening. They kind of
In what way is it different? Elaborate.
He kind of so he visits the farm, and like at the beginning of that section, it kind of talks about how it's not a farm he ends up visiting. It's like this sleek like corporate office building. And he's like, I couldn't find Rosie anywhere. And so it's just kind of that idea like it's kind of been like industrialized, and she's probably living in like a $20,000 like a 20,000 chicken coop, just like all the rest of them.
So he goes to Petaluma Poultry's headquarters, and it's just a standard corporate headquarters because Petaluma Poultry is a big organic company, just like Cascadia Farms, etc. And they grow their chickens very conventionally. And what I mean by conventionally is, you guys, have you gotten on Google Earth ever? Anybody? In the comments, click. What's that?
Just to look at my house.
Just to look at your house. Okay. Well, all of you should go and log on to Google Earth at some point in your lives, because it's actually kind of useful for a variety of things. I'm going to go find Google Earth on my computer and pull it up. Because how many of you have ever been, I'm going to turn on my participants tab so I can see your responses. Go to your participant area and click on yes if you've ever visited a modern chicken raising facility. Blake, you have. Mackenzie, you have. What were they like?
I was pretty young, so I don't remember. But
Mackenzie?
In high school, I was in FFA, and we went to like different farms that were like run by like Mizzou campuses and stuff like that. So it was like kind of like a college program.
Yep.
And we did like cow stuff too, like where you could stick the hand in the cow kind of thing, because it had like the little, I forget what it's called, but they had like different programs you could attend.
Yeah, so you were in an ag program and you got to stick your hand in a cow. That's nice. So did you go to a big industrial chicken house?
Yeah, and I've seen them too. Like there's just a crap ton of chicken everywhere, and like
yeah,
big,
they're these. Describe it for us, for those of us who haven't been to them.
Just a lot of chickens, and it's just like big like coops, I guess, like huge areas. Just, and it's kind of like overcrowded. It kind of seems.
Yeah, you've got these long, low slung coops that are big. They're very long in that way. Let me see. Where am I trying to find this? I guess I should have marked some of these before I came to class today. But I actually wasn't thinking that far ahead, I don't guess. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. So here's Google Earth. Can you guys see Google Earth? See it? Yeah. So here you have, this is outside of Springfield, and you can see that there's these two long barns here. There are another couple of long barns here. In the area around Springfield, there's actually a lot of chicken raising operations, as it turns out. And these are basically chicken operations. And if we put a ruler on this thing, let's do it in feet, because I think you guys can envision feet better than meters. This is it's about a 600-foot long chicken coop. And there are two of those, so that's about 1,200 feet of length, and then I would have to zoom in further to get a feel for how much area that is. But when you zoom in on these things, one of the things that you'll see is that there are little mini grain elevators right outside of this chicken coop, and that's where they store the grains that are then going to go into the feeding apparatus, and there's an automated feeding area. An automated feeding system that is going to deliver the grain to the chickens. And now I've zoomed in too far. But one of the other things that you will notice, and this is for whatever reason not very good imagery. Let's see if we can get some better imagery of these things. There's nothing around these except grass. There's no fence. When the chickens go into these coops, they basically spend their entire lives in these coops and go through all of their development inside of the coops. And if we go and look at this one over here, you'll see that it is similarly arranged. And once again, we have little grain elevators that are delivering material. These are propane tanks that are probably used to heat the coops in the winter time. And these are big blowers that will circulate air through the coop. And there's a big blower here that's drawing air out of the coop. And then these are vents up here that allow air to be drawn into the coop. So there's a constant circulation from, in this case, the north end of the coop to the south end of the coop. So this is what a modern industrialized method of growing chickens is like. And from 20,000 feet in the air, you can look down on the landscape and you can see where these operations exist, because, oh, here's some more of them over here. Because they have a very distinctive look to them on the landscape. It's these long big chicken coops. So at Petaluma Poultry, he didn't make it to one of the farms, but they described to him how their chickens are grown. Are their chickens grown any differently than these chickens that are being grown down in the Ozarks? Is Rosie the Petaluma Poultry free range organic chicken any different than these other chickens? Somebody other than Blake and Mary. And if they are different, how are they different? All right, how many of you read the chapter in preparation for today? Yes, Blake, I realize you did, and I realize Mary did as well. What about the rest of you? All right, this is just patently unproductive. I'm trying to have a conversation with you to get across the information to you. And while some of you say that you would prefer to have more class discussion, things like this, we have to have some common basis for discussing things. And in this case, the common basis is Poland's textbook and the USDA website dealing with organic standards, which is at the Agricultural Marketing Service. So if you log on to the Agricultural Marketing Service, you will find in their website, just search for organic standards or just search for programs, and it will come up under programs, and it will show you what those standards are. There are 3 forms of standards. There are standards having to do with plant standards. It has to do with how one grows the plants, what you can give plants, what you can't give plants, et cetera, et cetera. There are animal standards that have to do, once again, the kinds of feed that you give them and how you grow them, the facilities that you use for growing them. And then there are separate set of handling standards. How do you process these crops after they have been grown? So while you're on the Agricultural Marketing Service website looking at organic standards, pay careful attention to these 3 categories of things that are involved in the organic certification process. Read chapter 9 for Friday, the chapter on big organic, and come back on Friday prepared to actually have a discussion about these things, because Blake and Mary and I can do this, and I evidently cannot do this with the rest of you. So I need you to read the book because I want to have a conversation with you. So are there any questions about what we've done or not done today? All right, I will see you guys on Friday then.